Welcome back, Art 166 folks, and here we are with Principles of Design 2, continuing our quest to name every principle of design there is. Okay, unity is a goal. UNITY is a goal in design. We all want our graphic elements to be interrelated and form a greater whole. The whole is greater than the sum of the parts. When it's unified, all the graphic elements look as though they belong together. Fortunately, and we can use this to our advantage, and we do, this is what the brain wants. Now we're getting into human perception and how the brain works. The brain prefers order. That's why looking at this is so painful. This drives me crazy for so many reasons, which we'll probably get into at some point, but just compare how much happier your brain is looking at that than that. And you at this point, new to graphic design, probably can't even enumerate all the reasons why. You just have a reaction to it. And please, if you don't have a reaction to it, bring that to class. I think I want to know that. I'm not sure yet. So designers can exploit the brain's capacity to find and create order. In addition to helping us understand how the brain works and how it wants to seek out clear and direct communication, we can also use what we know about the brain, how it perceives things, to invent forms that are challenging and surprising and fun for the viewer. So, in other words, this is all good stuff to know. Gestalt. It is a German word, and it is a part of a series of visual relationships. It's a framework of spatial relationships that was developed in the 1920s by 3 different German psychologists. So the important part of that sentence is psychologists. So Gestalt is German for the word form. It places an emphasis on the perception of forms as organized wholes, and is concerned with how the mind attempts to impose order on the world, to unify and order perceptions. So there are 6 or 8, depending on who you are, basic Gestalt principles, and we're going to get into them now. So basically the point of all this is, if we understand how the brain works and what the human brain wants to do, we can exploit that to our advantage in our design. Because what are we doing? We are creating images to appeal to a human audience. So we have like insider knowledge into how the brain works, and we should make the best of it. So the first theory, Gestalt theory, is the theory of similarity. And this simply says we see 2 groups based on the similarity of elements. So I would challenge any of you to see this as anything other than but 3 yellow and 3 blue circles. We don't read it as 3 pairs of each color, a blue, yellow, blue, yellow, blue, yellow. We read it as the 3 blues and the 3 yellows. And ask yourself, why do we do that? They're all equally spaced. Well, actually, my yellows are dropped down a little bit, but you would still read it that way because of the theory of similarity. We lump similar things together. There's different ways to create similarity. First one is with shape, similarity of shape. Now, we just saw similarity of color. This is shape. We also can do similarity of size. When we look at those, we're going to lump them into small circles and larger circles. This one is color. And when I say we do, if you have disagreements with this with me, write them down and let's talk about them in the next class. That's one of the disadvantages of doing the class remotely and relying on videos, because sometimes I have to sort of assume things and you don't have a chance to ask questions or challenge me to ask more of the whys. So I don't want to lose out on the whys. It's one of the reasons I do a little review session in the following class in case there's some giant whys. So anyhow, we talked about shape, size, and also color. And for whatever reason, I decided to repeat that slide. All right, and moving on. The next theory is the theory of proximity. This says that objects that are close to one another will be grouped together, that we will visually group them together. So I would also say that I'm sure we all see this as two sets of 2, vertical, a top and a bottom on each one. We don't read it horizontally. We do it as the 2 groups that are stacked, almost 2 letter 8s almost. Our brain reads them as 2 separate things because of their proximity to one another. We see that here. We see these as three distinct groups because each group is closer. The elements in the first three, next three are all closer to each other, so it creates three groups. Then even within them, if you look at the first group, you lump the second two vertical lines together because they're closer to one another. This is something that if you become a web designer, this becomes very important, this sort of thing. You'll just do this innately, but it's good to point it out. So, okay, that gets my point. Who cares? Oh, look at that. If you're designing a computer keyboard or perhaps a website, something that contains a lot of elements, then you want to organize those elements in as intuitive a way as possible. And by intuitive, that just basically means in the natural way that the brain wants to work. And all these theories of Gestalt are based on how the brain wants to work. So hopefully I've made that abundantly clear. Yeah, basically that's what I just said. This uses theories of proximity and similarity. So things that are closer to each other are more related, and probably more proximity than similarity. For example, I don't know. I don't know enough about the keyboard. I'm not sure if the yellow keys, the background, and the mix are somehow related to each other. And maybe everything that's like danger zone, like the red, maybe red always says that. But I'd have to know more about the keyboard. But I know for sure that the things that are close to each other are related. I mean, interfaces like we have on Amazon do not happen by accident. These are studied. They're based on how the brain works. You've heard of the user experience, website, UX, UI. There's a lot that goes into how we see things. We talked about similarity and proximity. Okay, well, so on the left, the list of things are all closer to one another. So we read that as one menu, as one group. They're also similar in size. So we read them all together as one group, and we don't connect them with, say, the middle section where we see the words be inspired and come together with Georgia, whoever. We read that as a separate thing because it's in not only a different place, proximity, but it's also a different size, a different style. So they're using all these ways of seeing to organize information. And a lot of being a designer is organizing information. Through similarity of color, add to the cart by now on the lower right, those are the two actions that Amazon wants you to do. So those are cued to the same color. So we know those are related in some way. The streaming, MP3, audio, CD, vinyl, all those are the different ways. They're all pretty equivalent. They're different ways that you can choose to get to this cast recording. So we know that they're similar to each other because they're all the same shape, and they're all in a line, and they're close to one another. And on and on. The next theory of Gestalt is simplicity. Not that you care, but the word Pragnanz, Pragnanz, is a German word meaning good figure. And the law of Pragnanz is sometimes referred to as the law of good figure and the law of simplicity. I know, blah, blah, blah. So this law holds that our brain wants to reduce reality to the simplest form possible. So we want to see what's on the right, three combined squares, rather than the intricacy of the various overlapping lines on the one on the left. Not that the one on the left is all that complicated, but the one on the right is easier. Our brains do not want, this is like an evolutionary thing, it's one of the reasons humans have survived as long as we have. Our brains don't want to work any harder than they have to. That's not about being lazy, it's about survival, because you want to save your brain power for things that you need it for, like to stay alive and not get eaten by a dinosaur or whatever. You don't want to waste it on useless things. Okay, the next theory of Gestalt is the theory of closure, and this is we close that gap with our minds. If we present that to somebody, they will see they will close that gap. I mean, because it looks like a letter C, I might not close the gap and keep it as a letter C, but if we're just looking at it as a circle, the mind will close that up. So two good examples. We sort of more or less create where the man's face is, where Elvis's face is on the right. And on the left, we connect all those different lines together. in typorama. Those lines aren't connected, but we bridge those gaps because we want it to be closed. We want it to make sense. We want order. Now, continuity is the next Gestalt law or theory, and we like things to form a predictable pattern. So separate objects that look like they're joined, we read them as joined even if they're not, like this, like this. That's why we see this as a sort of narrative sequence with the bug at the upper right moving down the page and dying, sleeping, whatever. We see it as almost just a continuation, like a slow motion. All right. Our old friends, positive and negative space. This is one of the other theories of Gestalt, but we've already talked about this at length in our last class, so I'm just going to move on. Skipping. Symmetry, another theory of Gestalt, which we also have covered last class. Skipping. You don't see this one as much, but the Gestalt law of common fate basically says that when a series of objects move at the same speed in the same direction, we read that as part of a single stimulus. We assume that they belong in a group together. So because they're all in a formation going in the same direction, we just assume that, which, take it for what it is. Okay, well, there's a photographic example of what I'm talking about. We just assume all those planes are going in the same direction. All right, so our next design principle is alignment. Alignment is the placement of visual elements so that they line up in a composition. It's very practical. It's something And next we have an example of centered. The main, or all the copy rather, is centered on here. And centered works a lot better when you have less copy to deal with. If you have a massively long headline or a paragraph that's more than, say, what is that, about 50 words maybe, it gets to be too much. Because part of what we're doing is this left line on here that we see, because we read left to right, you read a line of text and your eye goes back like a typewriter. Well, you don't use old-fashioned typewriters anymore, but your eye goes right back to the left margin again and then goes back, snaps back again. So that left margin gives your eye a destination. That's why flush left is so much easier to read. If you're doing centered, you can tell just the shape of that text box. I'm looking at "We believe women can be absolutely anything," the body copy, I call it, under the headline. Your eye is constantly figuring out where to go because there's not that easy flush left point for your eye to snap back to. Hopefully that makes some kind of sense. Oops. Yeah, I did want to skip that. So here's one that's flush right. Everything's flush right. This is not an egregious, this is an ugly ad, but this is not an egregious example of bad flush right. But you'll hear me say it over and over again, I'm not a fan of flush right. And it's for exactly the reason that I just described. There's nowhere for your eye to snap back to. You read servers, and then you go back and you have to find bartenders, and you go back, you have to find and, then you have to find line code. Now, I'm exaggerating, that's only 4 lines, it's not that hard to read. But imagine if that was an entire paragraph. It just becomes just tedious. So which one is this? I'm asking you as you're doing this as a video. Well, you're right, it is flush left. The body copy is flush left. The chapter number, the 11 there, is centered on the page. And this will come up again, but you can mix alignments. They don't all have to be one or the other, but they have to make sense. Here's an example of centered. Now here's a little bit of a mix. We've got the headline, A Short Happy Life of Design Thinking is centered, but then the quotes underneath are flush left. But the name of the author, Damian Newman, is also centered. So that creates a nice parallel between the name of the title and the author. It gives them a visual connection, if you will. And then the quotes are a little bit different than that. And then if you look at the body copy, you'll notice it's not necessarily flush left. It's called justified or left justified. Justified type is kind of a fourth kind of alignment where it spans the entire width of your column. It is wonderful for creating shapes. It's wonderful for design. It's not always the most wonderful to read, and hopefully I have a good example of this, and that's because in an effort to equally spread or to fill the width of the column, you're going to get an uneven placement of spaces between letters and between words, and sometimes there's gigantic gaps in them. So it's something you have to do upon advisement. You have to, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Vertical alignment, briefly talked about that. Top, centered, bottom. Here's an example of centered. The type and the phone are centered together within the green box. Oh, there it is. Oh, okay. This is if we were actually meeting in class, this would be a little quiz. Both of these are examples of vertical alignment at the top. The body copy, John Mellencamp appears, and the Q&A all line up along an invisible guideline. Same thing for the Q&A with Florence Welch. The H in the black box and the type and her picture all line up on the top there, and that creates a structure for the page and makes it easier for people to read. Again, I'll always go back to this. You don't want your viewer, reader, whatever, to work too hard. So you want to create relationships between the elements on your page in order to make it, to say what you want to say and make sure that they read it. Because you can say what you want to say, but if you don't say it in an interesting, inviting way, they're going to tune you out. So alignment, we don't see the line where the elements are aligned. It's a invisible line, invisible visual elements where things are aligned, and can see that with the news and the date January 2011 and the text below it. We don't see that guideline, but it's implied. And when you're working in Illustrator or Photoshop or InDesign, this is a different thing. This is showing you what a grid looks like, but it does show you guidelines. So you do is you pull guidelines over, and then you can snap your various elements so that they line up together. All right. So alignment can be used to achieve a particular look and effect. And one should always be conscious when working with alignment that you're getting the effect that you want. This less text, very easy to read. I would say it's modern looking, but still fairly traditional. But you can also play with alignment if you wanted to do something like this. This whole series of the Stieg Larsson novels plays with this left, right, left, right, left, right. And it works because, first of all, it's a dramatic statement. There's not that many words, so you can afford to be a little wackier with it. And it's the nature of what these books are. It's not a science center like this one. It's a work of fiction. Just be sure that you're doing, if you're going to play with alignment, that you are doing it thoughtfully and not, we're going to visit this old friend again, and not doing it randomly. Here's a few examples in here. Dissect. I like to dissect things to see, why they don't work. Right in the middle, in the white area, the bullets. First of all, a lot of the text in these areas is way too big. That's not what we're talking about today, but that's one of the things. That all those bullets, 100% satisfied, guaranteed. 6 or 7 of them, they are crammed in that white space. The text is just too big for that space. But you want to create relationships so that people have less, quote, things to look at. You don't want their eye to have to go to too many things, or they're just going to not do it because it's too hard. For example, Summit Square Center, the address, which is below, and the phone number, there's no reason why that shouldn't be flush left with those bullets. So right now, you read those bullets, and then your eye has to go over and then read that center type. So you went from this flush left bullets to that center type. It's almost the same size text, which it shouldn't be. If we're talking hierarchy, those bullet points are much more important than an address, particularly in this day and age where most people just go to a website or make a phone call. So there's no reason for that crowded visual tension that they're creating, bad visual tension. Similarly, the email address underneath the logo, why aren't those things aligned with, say, family dentistry right under the logo and smaller? Right now, it's a gigantic other element that is fighting with the logo, and it's eclipsing it to a large extent, but it's giving your eyes too many things to look at. Why choose us with that flush right? That's not something I would do. I don't think that's horrible, but it's not great. And this, as I dissect it, this becomes more of a taste factor than anything else. I mean, this root canal, bad breath, all that stuff, none of that's aligned with anything, and it needn't be. Things don't always have to be aligned, and the style of this is very loose, but it just becomes a big jumbled mess. So this is kind of an exaggerated example of, don't let this happen to you. And that, I think, class of designers, Art 166, is the end of me talking about alignment. So do the quiz, bring your questions in for next class. We'll review some of this and add to it and go on to the next thing. All right, I'm out.